man by the name of Dick Backert, who has spent many tireless hours and years working in this cause. He is a friend and a patriot. Dick Backert.
Thanks, Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Birchers, guests, when my good friend Steve Thomas called me to ask if I would introduce Congressman McDonald this evening, I readily accepted and told Steve that I would be highly honored to do so, which I am. I thought I knew something about Larry McDonald's background until I received the biographical data that Steve sent me. Here it is, 4 legal-size sheets, single-spaced. It's full of achievements. Larry McDonald's life has been one of achievement, basically. He took his medical degree at Emory in 1957 at age 22. Honorable military service as a flight surgeon, professional and other awards, honorary degrees, memberships. It goes on and on. The author of books on the Constitution, Marxism, terrorism. The list is very impressive. If the congressman has done all of the things this list indicates, I must say that he is in incredibly good shape for a man of 93. Seriously, the list of Larry McDonald's accomplishments in his 48 years is one that any man would be proud to achieve in even the fullest lifetime. But Larry McDonald is not content, as are some, to rest on his laurels. The fact that he involved himself in the political process at all is testimony to his deep commitment to and love of this country and those whose sacrifices were supposed to have guaranteed the unalienable rights called out in the preamble. Larry McDonald could have just as easily remained out of the political fray, practiced medicine, earned a very handsome living, played golf every Wednesday with 3 other doctors, spent the weekends goofing off at the lake and having the same inane conversations with the same similarly unconcerned people on the Cobb County cocktail circuit. But Larry McDonald chose a different course for his life. As the point man in the movement to restore our severely wounded, moribund, some would say dead, Constitution, he has instead subjected himself to an incredible crescendo of ridicule and abuse by those who would have government become our master. Every 2 years, much of the Atlanta media rises up to vilify and castigate this man simply because he refuses to abandon his principles and go along to get along. If your perception of our speaker is one gained from what much of the media in Atlanta says about him, and this is your first in-person exposure to the congressman, please note that he does not have 2 heads, horns, or a forked tongue. In connection with the media, Larry, I think Dick Williams' recent apologia relative to your position and espousals on Latin America are hopefully a breakthrough in that area. I'm going to shut up and sit down in a second, but let me share a recently discovered quotation with you that I think summarizes Larry McDonald and his life. Mourn not the dead, but rather mourn the apathetic throng, the cowed and the meek, who seek the world's great anguish, who see the world's great anguish and its wrong, and dare not speak. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular and distinct privilege to introduce a man who has the courage to speak, a patriot, the Honorable Lawrence P. McDonald. Larry.
Thank you very much, Dick. And ladies and gentlemen, let me say it's a real pleasure to be back in Georgia. Yes, Dick, there were those 4 pages. My mother wrote those, and so it's appropriate. Dick mentioned that, rather than being an active person in all that's going on, I might have been enjoying the cocktail parties here at Cobb County or some such frivolous remark. I personally think that the most boring institution ever developed in the history of man is the American cocktail party. Some of you may view it as a time of great opportunity and excitement, but from my standpoint, I think it's the most boring thing we've ever put together. I don't know why we keep having them, but I guess it's part of the custom. I generally find myself in Washington with so many of the receptions and dinners that it's my responsibility to attend as the representative of the people in the 7th District for various conventions or various groups that are having their meetings there in Washington. And frequently these meetings are preceded by a standard cocktail party. And you find sort of a similar situation. Everyone standing around, if it's a man there, for example, the left hand usually is in his trousers pocket and the right hand is clutched around the glass. Everybody has sort of a plastic or wax look to them. Everybody looks somewhat interested. No one is able to understand anyone else. Someone is speaking, you're nodding your head yes. I sometimes wonder what it is I'm nodding to that people might be saying. I'm sure probably the same is reversed when I might be saying a word or two. But I think that sometimes it has to be the most boring institution that we have developed in our society. Let me say it's a pleasure to be back in Cobb County, and I appreciate this opportunity of coming before you and making a report on what is happening in Washington and a review of our heritage and the challenge and opportunities that are now before each and every person in this room, and indeed your friends and neighbors who are not here. Tonight's presentation will be broken into three areas. One will be a background of our status and a review of our heritage, and second is a review of where we are today, the problems that we face in Washington. And from my viewpoint, and I want to make this very clear, that we are not living in routine times, and the crisis that is now upon us. And finally, a review of an effective and efficient plan of attack in confronting just that crisis. I think it's first necessary to go back and to understand that as part of our heritage, we are now gaining the opportunity and potential to enter into our third transitional period as an American society. Those of you who have heard me speak before, you know I've mentioned this a number of times, this aspect of a potential for a third transition. And of course that requires first a review of the first two transitions, because we in this country have a rather unique heritage that is written into the basic documents of our government. And that is that we as Americans hold that we receive our fundamental rights, our basic rights, from a divine source, from God, and not government. And that the purpose of government in our society was to protect God-given rights. And that statement is listed in the Mayflower Compact. Prior to that, it was listed in the agreements that drew up the colony or the little community there at Jamestown, and restated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States. Now, our first transition took place during the period of the War of Independence. And I'm glad we have a board here, because I'd like to draw just a few things on the board. And we'll be changing this from time to time during the evening, but for that first part of understanding it, this being the left side of government, and this being the right side of government, of left and right, I think it's first important to do something that a lot of people never do, namely define the terms. And government, by definition, is the legal restraint by society over the individual. Now, we're not referring to what might be termed moral restraint that might come from your religious values. We're not referring to what might be termed cultural restraints of customs or taboos that may be instilled in your particular family or in your region, but we're referring to the legal restraint by society over the individual. If you have no restraint, then you would have no government or 0% government. Now, whether you are talking about a Nazi swastika, or whether you're talking about the symbol of an all-powerful pharaoh, or whether you're talking about the submission to the power of the banner of a Genghis Khan, or whether you're talking about international communism, if the government has total control over your property, over your life, over your time, if your property is not safe, if your life is not safe, if these things may be denied due to the power or the whims of government, then you are moving towards 100% government or total government, also referred to, of course, as totalitarian government or totalitarianism. And that is to the far left of the spectrum, at 100%. And on the far right is zero government, what we term anarchy. On the far left is totalitarianism or total government. Now, we were founded, I think if you had to pick an area, probably over here on the right-hand side of the spectrum, under the Articles of Confederation. And we fought the War of Independence under that form of government. Now, after that war was over, it had a very weak central government. The states may or may not support it in time of emergency. It was pretty much up to the state. And after the War of Independence, our founding fathers came together to perfect the Articles of Confederation. They felt that the Articles had been inadequate. And so for this reason, they moved more to the center, back to the center of the political spectrum. Or moved to the center of the political spectrum to an area in this zone. And this was our first transition as a society, moving to the midpoint of a political spectrum, moving away from that form of government a little bit too far to the right under the Articles of Confederation and moving to the center of the spectrum of the power of government under our first form, which of course we know as a constitutional republic. Now, our first president might accurately be termed John Hanson. Those of you who are stamp collectors, you know that recently there was a stamp issued honoring John Hanson of Maryland. And Mr. Hanson could be termed the president of the Congress of the Confederation. Now, after that first transition, our first president became George Washington. And this is the gentleman that we usually refer to as the first president of the United States, actually the first president of the Republic. And we shifted to the midpoint on the political spectrum. I think we would have to agree tonight that we had three separate areas of strength of our society. First was the concept of right and wrong legally in our society. Right and wrong in our society was to be determined by the law rather than the judgment decisions of men. That may sound very trite. Those of you who have been active in the JCs, you know that in the JC Creed it says that we believe in a government of law and not a government of men. Just reaffirming that statement that we accept the concept of a constitutional republic, government of law rather than that of men. Most governments down through the ages, right and wrong has been based upon the judgment decisions of men. Certainly most governments throughout the world today, right and wrong is based upon the judgment decisions of men. In our society, in this first transition, founding fathers said that for now and the future, right and wrong will not be based upon the bureaucracy, the Politburo, a ruling junta, a ruling religious figure, will not be based upon the lieutenants of a Genghis Khan. It instead will be based upon the rule book, the United States Constitution, and the high and the low of the land will have to produce, work at the marketplace in dealings with individuals based upon the law. Everyone had to play by the same rule book. And that is a very rare form of government. Now, we live in strange times, and people today are using words in very sloppy ways. You hear the People's Democratic Republic of South Yemen, or the People's Democratic Republic of Poland or East Germany, something like that. First place, it's a kind of an insult to the language because it's not a government of the people. In the second place, it's certainly not democratic. It's not a government based upon majority rule of the people. In the third place, most assuredly, it is not a republic. But the satellite nations that go under the title of the People's Democratic Republic, in short, are merely provinces dominated by the Soviet Union. Where there is a conflict with the Soviet Union, it's very clear which one wins out. Not the so-called people, not the democratic principles, and certainly not the local principles of a republic. This was very much in evidence in 1956 in Hungary. It was very much in evidence in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, as it is today in Poland. And so the law in our society was the Constitution, and technically we were thus, in that first transition, we became a constitutional republic at the midpoint of the political spectrum. That's of interest because in the contemporary media, conventional wisdom is presented as the right-wing government or leftist. I'm always amused that communist terrorists or communist armies are presented as leftists. There is almost an inability of the news media to use the word communist. It's leftist or left liberals or what have you. However, someone who espouses a return to limited government as defined by the Constitution, someone who would like to work to the restoration of the government at the midpoint of the spectrum, that person is generally characterized as an extreme right-winger. And yet, technically, as you can see, the extreme or the right wing would be going towards no government or anarchy, certainly not at the midpoint of the spectrum as our founding fathers understood so well. The second point, and incidentally on this, let me say our founding fathers understood this quite well. Virtually to a man in their private writings and discussions, they cited the value of government based upon law and the desire or the urging them to avoid government based upon a popular rule or based upon whim that might change from one year to the next. Thomas Jefferson said, and it's an interesting quotation because it was accurate for his time, but it is a very clear warning for our time. Thomas Jefferson said, yes, we did produce a near perfect republic, but will they keep it? Or will they, in the enjoyment of plenty, lose the memory of freedom? Material abundance without character is the surest way to destruction. Well, the second point that our founding fathers gave us as a pillar of strength in this first transition was a basis of prosperity, which we know today as a free enterprise system of economics. I think we could agree that it gains its strength not because it's a formal code of economics coming down from Washington or out of Atlanta, but rather the absence of such a code. In short, the decisions of individuals at the marketplace were to be made by the individuals, not to be made by outside forces, not to be made by the government, not to be made by outside forces of a monopoly, not to be made by the government, but rather by the individuals themselves at the marketplace. And certainly not according to the guilds, which had dominated and in many ways shackled Western civilization and retarded economic growth for about 1,000 years in European history. And the third basis of our foundation was that of a concept of right and wrong. And this was the foundation stone from which our legal values were to spring forth from, and or the Constitution was developed from a biblical concept of right and wrong, going back to the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament and the teachings of Christ in the New. Now, this would stand someone who was not a believer. It would give that individual stability. Someone did not have to be a believer to be in the United States, but nevertheless, right and wrong in our society, in terms of the glue of our society, would go back to those particular principles. Now, the philosophy of our founding fathers was that the function of the federal government was to be a protector of life and property, basically a negative function, to prevent harm, the loss of national sovereignty, to prevent the criminal element in the world from upsetting the American equation. But it was not to be a provider of goods and services. Our government was to protect, but not provide. Now, founding fathers knew that any time a central government presents itself to the people as being the provider of goods and services, two things will inevitably take place. If you study of history, it looks like that one nation after another has fallen into this trap. Once the government says, if you do not have enough food, if you do not have housing, if you do not have the medical care, and if you really can't get it, we will give it to you. Two things are inevitable. First, you will produce a conflict society. Once people are led to believe, if I don't have what I need, Atlanta or Washington is going to give it to me, then it is only natural that farmers would organize and threaten to strike to get what they view as theirs. That teachers would organize and use their political clout to get theirs. Big labor would certainly organize and use its muscle to get special laws passed to pick up the slack of monopoly labor practices. Big business certainly is not immune to the process. They will work to have laws passed so that shaky deals with Iron Curtain countries would be guaranteed if those deals fell through, and that the businesses or the banks would not be left holding the bag, and so forth down the line. In short, we would stop viewing ourselves as Americans, as part of a general society, but instead part of a special group that must now be ready to jostle and push and elbow its way ahead of the crowd to get to the trough in Washington before the trough is empty. Now, here in the 7th District, I can assure you that there are many people who believe that we should not have federal aid to the cities, that that's wrong. But if we're going to have it, we certainly want to be sure that Marietta gets there ahead of Chattanooga. We certainly want to be sure that Rome, Georgia gets there ahead of St. Louis. And this is the problem. Our founding fathers knew that if government presents itself to the people as the provider, that this is the inevitable result. The second thing that takes place, just as night follows the day, the demands will always exceed the ability of the Treasury to provide. You know, I have many people writing me in Washington, and sometimes the source of the letters surprises me a bit. People saying, Congressman, you're right. We really do need to cut federal spending. We really must balance the budget. We need to put our economic house in order, but we need to get back to our area what we sent up there. And I write back explaining to them that what, quote, you sent up here was spent 20 or 30 years ago. What you are demanding that we now get as listing as yours, or I use the term as theirs, legitimately theirs, this will be the blood of your children. And when you accept this grant or subsidy that you're making demands on, understand that in so doing, you will be casting your children into an era of slavery to pay for what you are now viewing as yours, or as they say, as theirs. Now, we emerged into the 20th century becoming the undisputed leader in virtually every field, and I think it was because of this marvelous heritage that we have. And in the 4th of July and Thanksgiving periods, we as Americans, as families, as communities, as our churches, we celebrate and give recognition to that past heritage. Now, having said that, it is important that we also admit to ourselves, at least, that that is a past heritage, and that what we have today is not an accurate that is not an accurate description of what we find ourselves in today, because we have destroyed that. We do not have those principles in existence today. The 19th century also saw the emergence of various forms of philosophy aimed towards a world domination or worldview. One of those was certainly the view of expressed by Karl Marx and by others, the abolition of private property, moving towards an international world order, who in the 20th century we know of as Marxism-Leninism. A second group was a group that disagreed with Marx on the methods, but agreed on the objectives. This is a group that went to him and said, Marx, we agree that private property must go. We agree that the few at the top are able to control the lives of society, of individuals, better than individuals are able to do so themselves. But we do not agree that the bloodshed and violence is necessary. And Marx, in his early days, said, you're fools, reactionaries, diversionaries, and you're wasting my time. But in 1872, he reversed himself, and he said, I am convinced in some countries it will be possible to adopt these principles without bloodshed and violence, but by the gradual approach of changing the parliamentary system, changing the laws until people will find themselves with that society. Of course, This is particularly the Fabian movement that began in England in the latter part of the 19th century. We view it under many different labels today: social democracy, democratic socialism, and so forth, not to be confused necessarily with the Democratic Party. But it has formed a very strong stranglehold over our society and our institutions here in this country. The Fabians correctly realized that it would probably not be England that would act as the fulcrum of Western civilization, but the United States. In the 1920s, the power or the axis was shifted to this country, moving into the colleges, aiming towards the textbook writing, the teaching philosophy, in so many of the critical schools, targeting in on the schools of law as the final target to change the concept of law in our society from one of constitutional law to that of social law. And I think any student of law today who's honest with himself will readily admit that we are guided by social law on the federal benches today. And the third area was that of an Anglo-American, especially Anglo-American fueled, not limited just to Anglo-American, but an Anglo-American and European elitism moving towards world government, feeling that the giant centers, springs of power and wealth could logically move towards an eventual world government structure in which along the way there would be a cooperation and sometimes subsidy of Marxism or Fabianism along the way. These three areas have had great impact upon the 20th century. Now in 1913, after some banking ups and downs in the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the American Congress was sold on the need to pass the Central Banking Apparatus Bill, the Federal Reserve Act. Now, many constitutional purists, I think certainly today, would look back and say the Federal Reserve System, if we're going to have a central banking apparatus, according to our Constitution, you should impose that or accept that by a constitutional amendment. It was not handled by the amendment process, but in the Christmas recess period, just prior to the Christmas recess period in 1913, the Central Banking Apparatus Bill, the Federal Reserve, was passed. Also, we passed the 16th and 17th Amendments, which had a great impact on our society, the direct taxation on personal income, and then the direct election of senators, which was moving away from the concept of limited government and individual states retaining segments of sovereignty to themselves. 1914, I think, was a date, if you wish to pick out a date, wherein very clearly civilization, especially Western civilization, perhaps leapt off into a lapse of insanity with the development of World War I. And this country's participation in World War I, from my view, is one of the great tragedies, and we have been on a toboggan slide ever since that we have not been able to recover from. And there were some very strong elements anxious to bring on the war for the power and the potential post-war alignment that such a war might allow. Now, the Reese committees were set up in the 1950s. The Reese Committee was set up in the Congress to study the foundations. Here we have some major tax-exempt groups in the United States that have great wealth brought to them, and yet for some reason, even though the wealth has come from the free enterprise system, so many of the foundations seem to be supporting collectivist views. And how can that be? And the Reese Committee was set up in the 1950s, named after Carroll Reese of Tennessee, who was to chair the committee, to study about the foundations. And what is it that the foundations are really after? Why is this paradox of money coming basically out of the free enterprise America being used to subsidize the destruction of exactly those same economic, social, and other freedoms that guarantees this opportunity for prosperity, opportunity for all of us? So one of their early functions, they went down to the Carnegie Endowment for Peace to study some of the early minutes of that foundation, just as part of the general review. And they were astounded to find in the minutes of the Carnegie Endowment before World War I, in the minutes, the discussions the need to bring on a global conflict, a world war, a global conflict for the value that the post-war alignment such a war would bring in the destruction of various areas of established order on the road to some type of a world order society. In May of 1915, the Lusitania was sunk off the shore of Ireland, and we in this country were told about the Lusitania being a passenger ship and how I think over 1,000 people lost their lives, what a tragedy it was. And this was an example of the barbarism there in Central Europe that was all the more reason why we must not be isolated from the conflict, while we certainly have a vested interest. The true bill of lading was clamped in a secrecy file for 50 years. The secrecy files were removed, and one enterprising writer, Colin Simpson, went and reviewed the bill of lading, the actual bill of lading, to find out the Lusitania was not a passenger ship, but actually had been an auxiliary cruiser, built as an auxiliary cruiser, and was carrying large amounts of munitions of war. And we had frankly been lied to, the British people had been lied to, all this period of time, and that it was a ship, in reality a warship that was using passengers sort of as a shield. And the growing amount of evidence that the Lusitania was deliberately sunk, engineered to be sunk, by collusion between people high up in the American government, in the Woodrow Wilson administration, and also in the British government, as a mechanism to be able to get the Americans active in the war. And then we, of course, entered the war in what might have wound up as sort of a stalemate, a standard European stalemate, with Europe working out the details to themselves. Instead, with our entry into the war, resulted in the disintegration of the stability of Central Europe. And it also resulted in a tremendous amount of bitterness, of frustration, that led directly into the conflict of World War II, the rise of totalitarian Nazism under Hitler, political extremism at its worst there in Central Europe, and perhaps even a greater spectrum of totalitarianism with the growth of the Bolshevik Empire, as the Russian people became the first victims of international communism. Now, we, after the war, we failed to join the League of Nations. This was a great shock to Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson's entry into the war and many of his compromises at the conference table, in the peace conference, all hinged upon the development of a League of Nations, in which, had we joined, we would have sacrificed large areas of our national sovereignty to international control. But there were a number of sovereignty-minded individuals in the United States Senate who argued very strongly against our ratification of the League of Nations Treaty and our entry into the League of Nations. And the result is that we did not. Now, this was very frustrating to a number of the policy makers who had worked to get us into the League. And Colonel Edward Mandell House, who in many ways was sort of the shadow president during the Woodrow Wilson period, had a number of bright young men meeting with him in 1919 at the Carillion Hotel in Paris to form a propaganda group, to form an information group, organization known as the Council on Foreign Relations, to be able to change the thinking in America among the American people so that they would be willing to move away from a pioneer, more of an independent society, into a society that would be willing to move towards internationalism or internationalist objectives. Now, the group known as the Council on Foreign Relations had actually been founded in 1918 in New York City. It was a rather small group, insignificant, really wasn't going anyplace. And so after one or two name changes, the group that was founded by House merged with the Council on Foreign Relations, took their name, and has proceeded to move very aggressively towards changing the thinking patterns of Americans to be able to embrace internationalism in its education, in its news media, in its governmental policies, and moving away from the concepts that our founding fathers gave us in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 1920s and then in the 30s, tremendous financing came into this particular segment of internationalism. in this country from the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and others, which has made this to be perhaps the most powerful organization in America, dominating American society, what would be termed the establishment, and the American government easily for the last 40 years. Now, in financing World War I, much of this was made possible through the creation of the central banking apparatus, the Federal Reserve. Because while it was designed to even out the peaks and troughs of the economic cycle, in reality, it allowed the federal government, in essence, the control of credit, the control of the money supply, but most particularly, the creation of an engine of inflation. A mechanism now where the federal government could spend endlessly without the checks that a budget would otherwise require. And much of the financing for World War I was financed through the Federal Reserve in debt financing. Now, we did have balanced budgets in the 1920s, but there was tremendous credit expansion through the banking system, utilizing the powers of the Fed and other banking powers. So there was tremendous credit expansion and a false prosperity that grew during the 20s. And in 1928, the Federal Reserve slammed on the expansion of money and credit. This hit the business world by 1929. And that was the end of our first transitional period as a constitutional republic. If you wish to try to point to a date when it was on its deathbed, it was with the coming of the Great Depression. Because at that time, we had media writers, we had media pundits of all types, so-called national leaders, that said that the principles of 1776 and the principles of the Constitution were all right for an agrarian society, all right for a pioneer society. But we're now in an industrial society. We must now have government with increased power to be able to handle these emergencies. And we must be willing to change many of the limitations that a constitution otherwise would impose. And now this probably is going to get a lot of people upset, that those of you who came here viewing yourselves as Republicans. This, of course, brought on justification for what we term today as the New Deal. And the father of the New Deal was actually Herbert Hoover. And up to the time of his death, Herbert Hoover bragged that he had actually been the father of the New Deal. No one ever listened to him, particularly because of the Hoover Commission reports during the 40s and 50s, when many people associated Herbert Hoover with efforts to streamline government, economize in government. But so many of the programs that reached their full bloom in the 30s and 40s and even early 50s, the prototypes for those programs were laid down by Herbert Hoover, not FDR. And so many of the areas of the expansion of government in the marketplace, intervention in the monetary system, was actually laid by Herbert Hoover. So that the depression that we went into as the slamming on the brakes in the Fed in 1928 hit the business world in the fall of 1929, the response to this was that, gosh, we desperately must have a government that's going to be responsive, a government that's going to intervene for the problems of unemployment, for the problems of maintaining prices at a certain level. And Hoover met that response, and a Democratic candidate was a very popular individual, a magnificent speaker, by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it's an interesting exercise. I recently did this at Western Goals Foundation, going back and rereading so many of his speeches from about 1928, 29 up through 1933. And they were speeches that, frankly, in so many segments, I would be proud to state today. Roosevelt criticized Hoover for spending us into the mess. And it had been Hoover's fascination for government, of creating unnecessary bureaucracies of government, that Hoover had created this mess by the tremendous expansion in the size, cost, and scope of government. And Roosevelt promised that as president, if elected, he would slash government expenditures by 25% just for openers. And indeed, the Democratic Party platform pledged to cut federal spending by 25%, right down there in the platform. And he criticized Hoover for spending us into the mess, believe it or not, with some justification. It's not completely honest, but there was some thread of honesty to that. And of course, FDR, once elected in 1932, went on then to make Hoover appear to be an absolute Scrooge by comparison, because we then launched upon tremendous expansion in the role and scope of government. And that entered into our second phase of our governmental system. Now, we were restricted from the natural government transition to the left of the spectrum, which has been the problem that governments have given their people down through the ages. That governments tend to grow. Small people, you give them a desk, and before you know it, they've got 5 people working for them. Come back 3 years later, and they've got 20 people working for them. That natural tendency to become empire builders, I guess, is built into every bureaucrat to start padding their justification for existence. There's a natural tendency for government to grow and become oppressive. It's the nature of the beast. Our founding fathers tried to stop this leftward growth by building a strong fence around what the federal government could do. That fence was called the United States Constitution. Now, when Mr. Roosevelt came in, he proceeded to advocate programs and the expansion of programs clearly to the left of the Constitution. And you may recall that the Supreme Court said, Mr. Roosevelt, this program is unconstitutional, that program is unconstitutional, you may not go that direction. Brought ridicule upon them. Many of them were disgusted, became retired, and they were replaced. And by 1936 or 1937, the concept of law in our society had moved away from the concept of limited government, of constitutional government, and we began increasingly to embrace social law as the basis of governing legal decisions. And that resulted in the destruction of the limitations placed upon the government. So that since 1934, 35, 36, we have seen a steady leftward surge of government, moving towards greater and greater government. And of course, the ultimate result is that you wind up, I don't care what name you wish to give it, you wind up with total government, and you lose your liberties. And that's been sort of the dilemma, that you wind up losing your liberties. You have to have a revolution, violent overthrow, in order to get government back into the hands of the people. And you may recall that when our founding fathers made this initial shift, Thomas Jefferson was very fearful that if we make that shift and give federal government more power, we will have to have a revolution every 25 years just to get government back into the hands of the people, referring to exactly this type of process that is periodically necessary. It was at this point that Madison piped up and said, no, not necessarily so, Tom. He said that if we adopt Montesquieu's theories of the division of power of government, it may be possible to put government at the midpoint of the spectrum and hold it there. The problem is not in placing government. The problem is in holding government to wherever you place it. So that's exactly what they did by setting up a modern constitutional republic designed to keep government limited. Beautiful system. Served us very well for over 100 years, almost 150 years. And then we saw the second transition of our society that we have been on for 50 years. Now you go back to the speeches of the 1930s on the House and Senate floor. And you will see that senators and congressmen will state that if we adopt this new concept of the growth and scope of the federal government, we will be able to eliminate all poverty, eliminate all ignorance, we will eliminate all crime. And we will be able to enter into, here in the United States, a utopian period only dreamed of by the poets of the past. That was the promise. But I think the best summation of the New Deal was spelled out by one of the architects of the New Deal, a man who was an administrative assistant to President Roosevelt. It was said in the mid-1930s, I think it was first made at a racetrack. Those of you have heard me speak before, I've made reference to this because I think it's such a classic quotation. It was not meant to be on the record. It was meant to be an off-the-record quote. but someone put it on the record, someone quoted in the media, so it got out as an official quote. And there was an individual who's still living who was at that particular press conference where Harry Hopkins admitted that, yes, those were his words, and yes, that's a pretty good summation of the New Deal. And the summation, according to Harry Hopkins, was that the real concept that they were working for were 3 points: to tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect. He added a 4th little footnote: because the people are too damn dumb to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can read every book in every library in the United States. I do not believe you can find a better summation of the last 50 years than that expressed by Harry Hopkins. That we in Washington, we know what's best for the people. We'll devise ever more ingenious ways to tax people and then tax them again. We'll tax them directly, and we will then tax them indirectly through inflation and other mechanisms. And in the final areas, in return, we will keep this tax money going out to ever more vocal special interest groups. Tax and tax, spend and spend. But in return, these special interest groups, whether it be the elderly, whether it be the farm community, whether it be the labor community, in return, they have to give us their votes to elect and elect our crowd, and we'll keep the process going over and over because the people are too damn dumb to understand. And one of the real tragedies is that in our society that we value as an open society, so many segments, I feel, in the news media, particularly in the editorial opinion areas, are very strongly in sympathy with that philosophy. And so therefore they do precious little to expose how the game is being played. So I think that summation by Harry Hopkins is an excellent one that gives the best summation that I have seen of the last 50 years. So we saw that shift in philosophy, that the government now was to become more and more of a provider of goods and services, not so much necessarily being one preoccupied with the protection. We saw the transition of the Supreme Court in philosophy by 1936 or 37. So that today the federal government really can do anything it wants to do. People ask me, is such and such constitutional? Is the government allowed to do this and do that? Well, I know what the Constitution says. I think it's pretty easy to interpret according to plain English. But I caution audiences and I caution individuals to understand that we're not living in a period of constitutional law. And what you may think the Constitution says, what I may think the Constitution says, is really immaterial. Because we're living in a period where the judges are deciding what is best for the people. And they sometimes give reference to a Constitution, but what they decide today may clearly be changed tomorrow. And I think one of the worst examples of that, frankly, was the recent case involving Bob Jones University. It doesn't make a difference whether you like Bob Jones, do not like Bob Jones, or what have you, but where they, in essence, gave to the IRS the authority to determine what is in the public good, a very vague new concept of governing laws or restraint of society. Today, after over 50 years, it is important to realize that our constitutional republic, the government of right and wrong based upon the law, has changed. Today, you are not governed by the law. We give lip service to the law when we give the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands. The republic today has been largely replaced by a bureaucratic mobocracy. Free enterprise today is just a skeleton of its former self. Today, you are no longer allowed to make decisions of hiring and firing, manufacturing, distribution, and pricing as you wish. Today, you are heavily shackled by government bureaucracies, government regulations at every step in the marketplace. And lastly, and perhaps most important, our biblical heritage has been largely replaced by a concept of humanism, where right and wrong from a moral basis does not stem from eternal values, but comes from the concept of what is good for man. and the worship of man. And therefore, that it is man and man's agency, government, that determines what is right and wrong today. And whatever serves the growth of man and his agency, that is the new morality. And you really do not have to be a genius to see this. All you have to do is take the time to look at our news media, take the time to look at the textbooks that our school children use, take a very brief glance, you do not have to dwell, on what would be termed the entertainment segments of American society, television, magazines at the 7-Eleven store, what have you, to see that we have readily embraced the new morality of anything goes. Or the view that you only go around once in life and you want to get all the gusto you can. In other words, it's the gusto that's important, not how you go around. And I think that has been the new area. And the tragedy is that you also see this so often from our church pulpits and even in church literature, where the areas that should be the most zealous guardians of protecting a biblical-based morality have been willing to accept situation ethics. And many so-called theologians are writing on the concept of situation ethics that there are no longer eternal truths, no longer right and wrong as your parents have taught you, but rather you yourself must decide at each situation what it is to be. And that is the new view. And the economic impact of all of this, of course, has been the enormous growth in the size and scope of the federal government. We are now discussing in Washington a federal budget coming close to $1 trillion. When you start figuring off-budget areas of spending, areas of borrowing for international agencies, it'll be right at the $900 billion level. When you start figuring areas of overruns, we are now approaching a $1 trillion national budget. The deficit fiscal year 83 is going to be in the range of $200 billion. The estimated deficit for fiscal year 84, which begins in October of this year around October of 84, is estimated now in the range of $250 billion. Only a short time ago, about 2 years ago, we accepted a national debt of $1 trillion. In about 3 years, we will be at a national debt, official national debt, of $2 trillion. Now, the unofficial debt, when you figure areas of unfunded liability, obligations made by the government, really approaches about $10 trillion. When you figure promises made in Social Security and other programs, you're looking at promises that our children will have to pay, one way or the other, of approaching that amount. Now, when I went to Davidson in pre-medical training, we had a lot of economic bubbleheads. This was the early 50s. They were running around, some of them teaching economics, said you don't need to worry about debt. After all, you owe it to yourself, or we owe it to ourselves, was the standard cliche. Today, just paying the interest on the national debt is 1/3 of the budget. It's running at a rate of about $5,000 per second, 60 seconds to every minute, 60 minutes to every hour. The third largest area of the budget, and steadily growing, and now running notably in excess of $100 billion a year, not to pay the principal, just to service this massive debt. And in a very short time, it's going to be moving up to $200 billion a year, just paying the interest. So much for those who said that debt really does not matter. Now, after this background, many Americans, after 50 years of this flirtation with big government to solve every problem, if you get sick, government will look after you. If you need food, government's got food stamps for you. If your business is failing, don't worry, there's a government loan for you. If you need housing, there's a government loan for you. If you take drugs, don't worry, there's a government program to get you off drugs. We'll get you hooked on something else. If you want to violate basic moral principles, get some type of a social disease, don't worry, we've got a government program for you. In fact, we used to just limit this to the various venereal diseases. The new fascination in Washington is with AIDS, which is an affliction that especially hits the homosexual community. And now there's a new move we just passed in the Congress to spend millions of dollars to set up studies for problems of AIDS. There were some of us in Congress that thought it might be an appropriate time to perhaps have a user tax and to register those involved and merely tax them to be able to finance the research involved. But I'm afraid with the current makeup of Congress, they would never agree to that, because many of them certainly would not want that increased taxes for themselves. Now, in 1976, a man from Georgia, Jimmy Carter, ran for a high office, and I think correctly analyzing that people were fed up with the insider crowd that had been running the show. So of an unelected elite, an establishment that has dominated our society. It was a very perceptive analysis on the part of the gentleman from Georgia. And he correctly perceived that the Americans are fed up with the slick talkers, and he also perceived that there is a vast untapped resource in America, about 40 million people, who are very devout in their personal lives and in their value systems. And this segment of American society, by and large, has not been involved in the political process probably for most of the 20th century. Many of them not even registered to vote. And I think he perceived that there is a resource there that could be appealed to, and he could gain that block as an added block in the winning of an election. Mr. Carter ran in the post-Watergate climate, presenting himself as a born-again Christian. And that was certainly one of the main themes, and no bones about it, that he would never lie to us. And he said if ever he lied, work to get him out of office. That he was an outsider to the establishment, and that he would balance the budget in 4 years, and the promise that never in his lifetime would he give away the Panama Canal. That was a speech I think was made in Kentucky and in other areas. Now, following 4 years of Jimmy Carter, there was tremendous disillusionment. Many people felt that very clearly they had been lied to. We certainly did not have a balanced budget. The Panama Canal promise lasted a little less than 12 months. And it looked like, in spite of the pledge to bring in outsiders, that the cabinet was made up of the same tired old faces representing the same elitist groups that had dominated our society for 40 or 50 years in the cabinet and elsewhere. So after 50 years of irritation and rejection of the belief that more government is going to solve the problems created by government too large, Carter was voted out in November of 1980, and Mr. Ronald Reagan was voted in. The greatest change, the greatest test of the change in the American sentiment, however, took place with the Senate elections of November of 1980. Because in the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, you saw Republicans and Democrats thrown out of office. Senators who had advocated America's leftward surge on the political spectrum, had advocated that, were defeated, one after another. Church was defeated, McGovern was defeated, Bayh was defeated, Culver was defeated, Gravel was defeated, Javits was defeated, and so forth. And in every instance, replaced by someone who, at least in their speeches, exhibited sentiments closer to traditional values in our society. Reagan ran on the pledge to cut the size and cost of government, to reduce taxes, to close the window of vulnerability with regard to our national defense, and to defund the left. To defund, cut out the tax money and subsidies going to the numerous, about 10,000, left-wing organizations in this country, and to move to balance the budget, to restore the constitutional basis of state government in relationship to the federal government and responsibilities and so forth. In short, it was a pledge to reverse 50 years of collectivism at home and internationalism and compromise abroad. Well, what happened? Many Americans, particularly concerned Republicans, were shocked to find that the running mate chosen was George Bush, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, an extra elitist group formed in 1973 by David Rockefeller, sort of an elite of the elite. That gentleman was chosen for vice presidency. Now that is strange because 2 weeks before the convention in Detroit, Mr. Reagan, in private conversation with Mr. Joe Coors of Coors Breweries and also with Paul Laxalt, Senator Laxalt, stated that he did not know exactly who he would have as vice president, but under no circumstances would he choose George Bush. Now, in September of 1980, there was another statement made by the president-to-be that bothered a lot of Americans. And this was that in coming to grips with the economic problems of this country, that we would move to do so on a gradual basis, not a dramatic basis. But we would move to gradually change the economic problems that we have. And thus, we have seen over the last 2.5 to 3 years, 4 separate economic schools presented to the American public in terms of philosophy, in terms of impact upon our national government. First has been the hard money school. This is the free market, free enterprise school, championed by Nobel Prize winner Friedrich von Hayek, American economic writer Henry Hazlitt, and many others. And this happens to be the economic school that I personally support. But that was one school. The second school was supply-side economic school. And this was championed by Congressman Jack Kemp, George Gilder, who wrote the book Wealth and Poverty, and also Roth in the Senate. That was a second school. It's sort of a halfway house between Keynesian economics and free market economics. Now, there was a third school of monetarism championed by Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman, and this was tied to the Fed of controlling the interest rates through the policies at the Fed of controlling the money supply policies, and feeling that gold really does not matter, and that a certain degree of deficit may even be good for our society, that we do not need to have a fascination for a balanced budget. And then a fourth school of economics was that really of a sort of a conservative Keynesian economic school, basically a key variant of the economic philosophy of the New Deal. Now, the hard money free market school view has been only used in presidential speeches. It has not been part of the policies in Washington. It's been very effectively used in speeches, particularly the speeches of the 1980s and 1981. But the policies in Washington have not been those of the free market, free enterprise school. The second area, the supply side school, was tried for about 1.5 years. As of last August, the supply side school, which calls for cutting taxes and increasing the amount of revenue of the government by stimulating the incentive to work, that was tried for 1.5 years, for all of 1981 and for half of 82, and it is completely scrapped. We're no longer in supply side school. And the monetarism school has been used at the Fed, and that is now being discarded. So frankly, of the 4 schools that have been discussed or advocated in whole or part over the last 2 years, we are now operating aggressively under the one remaining school, back to Keynesian economics. Now, some of you who are tried and true Republicans above all, that is not a welcome voice to hear. But we must make a distinction between actions and words. A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in the Congress with the 2 Crane brothers, Phil Crane and Dan Crane, and we were discussing this dilemma. And one of the frustrations we have in coming back and speaking to the districts is that the people back in the districts are listening to the speeches. we in Washington are dealing with policies. And how do we try to reconcile policies that are going one way in our discussions with people back in the district and explain that the policies are going the other way without discrediting ourselves? Because so many people who are good Americans, who wish the very best, want to believe that we are on the right road. And when sometimes a representative comes back and says we really have some serious problems that we're not addressing, that almost is viewed as a treasonous statement or as heresy. So there is a real credibility gap